Hello and welcome to COP Conversations, a special podcast series where Carbon Copy breaks down the politics, promises, and power plays at COP30 with a sharp focus on what it means for India and the global south. I'm Shreya Jai, and for our latest episode, I'm thrilled to introduce Vijaya Ramachandran, Director of Energy and Development at the Breakthrough Institute. Vijaya, thank you for being here. We welcome you.
Thank you so much, Shreya. Thanks for having me.
We'll just jump into the conversation with a very important topic that is impacting almost everything that we are discussing these days. And those are the Trumpian policies, especially on fossil fuels and clean energy. I want to understand from you, have we started witnessing the impact of some of the policies that US President has put out on fuels, on clean energy, with respect to financing of these sectors?
Yes, I believe we have. This has been a huge shift from the previous administration. The Trump administration has adopted a radically different approach to energy policy than the Biden administration. And I think we are starting to see the effects of President Trump's policies, both domestically and internationally. I think a few things come to mind. First of all, the quest for energy dominance in the US, and particularly to become the world's largest exporter of natural gas. I think we're seeing several steps being taken towards achieving that goal, and I think the US is well on its way to becoming the number one exporter of gas, both to rich countries and to developing countries, emerging markets, and so on. Secondly, we're seeing a shift away from renewable energy subsidies, which I think, in some cases may be a good thing, particularly where technologies are mature. There's no need for subsidies. But in other cases, I think are probably going to delay the development of these technologies. I'm particularly concerned about the sort of cancellation of subsidies around battery technologies, which I think are extremely important for the renewable sector. So, we are seeing some shifts. We're seeing some changes to the kinds of things that are being emphasized, the kinds of subsidies that are being offered in the energy sector. I think broadly speaking, this administration is adopting an all of the above approach to energy rather than an emphasis on renewables, as was the case with the Biden administration.
Right, absolutely. Quite different and quite away from what we saw earlier. These policies seems to be poles apart. The question now emerges, and this is clearly from my vantage point, as this is any of it benefiting the developing world? Because the president and his cabinet does make it sound like that they're there for their friends in the global south. But is it really benefiting? And if not, do you think that there's more harm than benefit out of it?
I think I have a somewhat contrarian view on this. There is a lot of concern that this administration's policies will be harmful to developing countries. But I am of the view that an all of the above approach to energy is the right approach. And it's the right approach for the poorest countries that should be allocated all of the remaining carbon budget. So I think President Trump's messaging particularly to countries in sub-Saharan Africa, a message that is also promoted by Energy Secretary Chris Wright, is that this administration will no longer impose financing bans on fossil fuels, and it will no longer impose its energy preferences on poor countries. I very much welcome this message. I think for Africa, its natural gas reserves must be exploited, particularly to meet its industrial needs, particularly for factories, for private sector firms, for large-scale industrialization that is yet to occur across much of the continent. And this message that the US is there to support as an energy partner whatever the preferences are of poor countries in terms of their energy mix, I think is a very welcome message. I want to point to a recent US Africa summit where Secretary Wright made a very powerful speech to make the point that this administration will not impose its preferences on Africans, and the entire audience, largely of African policymakers, energy ministers, and so on, stood up and cheered. And so I think on that front, the messaging is very welcome. The lack of sort of policing of energy choices is very welcome. I think on the subsidy side, the poor countries could really benefit from subsidies to things like batteries and other types of renewable energy. I think we're seeing a shift away from that, and that may delay the onset or the use of these types of technologies around the world. But by and large, I have a contrarian view to most people, I think, where I think that this kind of broad-based approach to the energy sector very much welcome across the world. Countries that are using a whole mix of energy sources to meet their needs, I think, very much appreciate the hands-off messaging.
That's a great point, and I read your wonderful piece as well that you had written for the foreign policy, wherein you had talked about this and how it's a rare moment, as you just mentioned, for the African leaders, and they did cheer. That brings me to another point, and good that you mentioned fossil fuels, and let's go a bit more into fossil fuel usage, because it's not just these policies that are emerging out of the United States that is impacting or favoring enhanced fossil fuel usage. A lot of what is happening at geopolitically, be it global trade wars, US China, US Russia, China India, seems to be tilting the energy security debate in favor of enhanced fossil fuel usage. Good news for countries such as India, which has been saying that, we will not back down on coal. We have 1.4 billion population to, their energy security needs to meet. Am I catching this trend correct? And I would love to hear your views on that.
It's an excellent point, Shreya. I'm really glad you raised it. I think there's no question that the decrease in supply of cheap Russian gas has changed the geopolitics of the energy sector completely. So, even while the US and the Europeans were lecturing everyone about renewables only and about not using fossil fuels, they themselves were very heavily reliant, particularly Europe, very heavily reliant on cheap Russian gas. I think the cutoff of that supply of gas has changed everything in rich countries, and it's kind of revealed the hypocrisy of the messaging to countries like India. So that's one big factor I think that's changed, and I don't see that going back to the previous sort of state of affairs. I think we will see a long-term effect of the changes to the energy sector arising from the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the cutoff of Russian gas and so on. So that's one big factor. The other is that there are more global conflicts, as you mentioned, and the sort of outcome of all of this is, that we are in a very different environment now than we were 4 years ago, 8 years ago. There's also no longer a supply of sort of very cheap money to subsidize, sort of our favorite energy sources. So I think what we're seeing now is a mix of energy sources coming into play that combines fossil fuels. In the case of India and Indonesia, it's coal. In the case of Africa, it's natural gas. In other countries, it's a mix of the two, and as well as many renewables. I mean, there's no question that renewables are entering the energy sector and will continue to do so for a while. The U.S. is now at, I think, about 20% in terms of renewable energy. That share will probably rise, but we are seeing a much broader mix that I think will remain in play for several decades. So many reasons for this, some of which you have mentioned, the fact that we have these wars, the fact that we have changes to the supply of gas, but then also the fact that there's, many things you cannot do with renewables. You need coal for industrialization. You need natural gas to make fertilizer. You need kind of firm power sources for many things that, wind and solar cannot provide. provide. Transportation needs liquid fuels. Cold storage often needs some type of fossil energy, natural gas or some kind of petroleum source. Clean cooking needs liquid petroleum gas. So I think that we will see a mix of fossil fuels in play for a very long time. I think we'll also see an increasing share of renewables. And then on the horizon, we will probably see an increasing share of nuclear power, although that may take a while.
Yeah, I was thinking to come on nuclear because in the middle of this coal, gas versus RE debate, suddenly nuclear is emerging as a viable option among developed countries. There are plans of being nuclear being put back to action. There are grand plans being announced, including in India. The Prime Minister mentioned in his Independence Day speech. So my question is not from the context of developed world. It is from the developing nations and poor nations. Can they get on that nuclear bandwagon, and how? Because it's tricky.
It is, and it involves, I think, a significant amount of regulatory capacity, which we are even struggling with here in the US. I think for many reasons, the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission is also very challenged by this effort on the part of the Trump administration to ramp up nuclear power in the US. Part of the challenge is how to kind of understand and manage the new technologies that are on the horizon. So, India, for example, is very invested in thorium reactors, and that's been around for a while. So, I think, India has regulatory capacity to manage that. But here in the US, we are very excited about small modular reactors, SMRs, which can supply electricity to, mid-sized cities or even parts of large cities in a very different way than the old types of reactors. Much less waste, much less risks. The risks are lower of these SMRs, but we need the regulatory environment to put these SMRs into use. So I think that it has tremendous potential. I think once countries see some small modular reactors functioning in the US, there'll be a lot of demand, particularly in emerging markets. And for developing countries or countries that are, lower income countries, again, they'll have to build up the regulatory capacity. But I think there's substantial interest in nuclear power because it meets both criteria. It's both very clean and it's firm, it's continuous power, it's not intermittent, it's not variable like solar and wind. It can be used for large scale industrialization, it can be used for many different things. And so lots of excitement, I think big challenges to overcome before we see these types of technologies broadly used, even in the US.
I agree. There are challenges because back home here in India, there are still policies being redesigned, redrafted. And I think the technology has changed completely in the last, I think, 10 to 12 years when we have been completely silent on nuclear. Technologies have changed, there are new policies, new challenges. But do you think nuclear also emerging as an option of a technology transfer partnership between US and countries such as India, which are a huge energy market?
Exactly. And I think many in the US see India as a potential market. It has many of the preconditions, right? It has the regulatory capacity, it has the institutions in place, it has substantial technical know how, a very deep pool of scientific talent within the country. So I think for US producers of SMRs and even other types of nuclear technology, India is a very attractive market. And I can see scope for quite significant collaboration between the two countries around nuclear power, in a variety of ways. So some of the older stuff, the thorium and so on, but then also, some of these newer technologies where India could possibly even play a very significant role in adaptation of the technology to further lower costs and to make it more useful in developing country contexts.
Right, absolutely. Can I jump back to energy transition again? And I want to really discuss it because we want to discuss money here, which is so important among all this. Be it poor countries taking up nuclear or expanding on their coal and gas ambitions, or even renewable energy requires a lot of money, and that has been going for a very topsy turvy ride for several years. The global climate dialogue is lopsided. We all know that. And that clearly is not helping poor nations to step away from fossil fuels, if we can say so, or maybe plan a very just and balanced energy transition. So, first let's start with what is your outlook on their energy transition and what exactly should it look like? Because it cannot be just you're replacing coal with solar. It has to be balanced, wholesome, something that you have been writing about. So, can you explain us what does it look like? Should it look
Yeah,
like?
yeah, absolutely. I think rich countries have not found uh, a decarbonization path for poor countries. They have not been able to identify one that makes sense or one that works. At the same time, they are insisting that countries like India move away from coal, or that more broadly, emerging market countries and developing countries decarbonize rapidly. That is not a viable proposition in the environment that we're in, given the technologies that we have and given the kinds of resources that are being provided to countries. I think we have to be really clear about that. I don't think rich countries have delivered for poor countries, broadly speaking. On the money front, I think it's just been a huge failure, and this is why I'm not optimistic about the COP process and its ability to kind of assist poor countries with climate adaptation, which is what they really need the money for. There was 100 billion a year promise in 2009 that was barely delivered. There are organizations like CARE International, for example, that argue that the money was taken from development projects and handed over as climate money, which doesn't benefit poor countries. That's not a good way to do that. Then there have been promises. At the last COP, I think there was a $300 billion promise, but we are not seeing those kinds of resources coming the way of developing countries. At the same time, the rich countries are making demands on countries not to use their natural gas reserves, not to exploit their coal reserves, to only develop with wind and solar. This is simply not viable. And in that regard, I think the change of administration in the US has been very helpful in terms of moving away from that very non constructive, very heavy handed dialogue towards poor countries. That said, I agree with you, Shreya, that a lot more needs to be done in terms of helping poor countries adapt to climate change, adapt to rising sea levels, adapt to hotter temperatures, and then also to use these newer energy technologies, which are cleaner, things like nuclear power, or even natural gas technologies that reduce methane leakage, for example. These are the kinds of things that rich countries should be helping to kind of finance in poor countries. We aren't seeing enough of that. I'm not sure that this COP process will deliver on that. I think it's something that we just have to keep pushing for. At the same time, I think developing countries also need to sort of look internally, find sources of finance from within, find sources of finance from newer donors such as the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, other sort of emerging donors, in order to carry out this energy transition. Because certainly the older traditional donors in the US and Europe are sort of less able to deliver than they used to be, and at the same time, I think, at least in the European case, making demands that I think are untenable.
Thank you for taking some very interesting names there when we discuss financing energy transition, because these names usually don't come up. We hear, the usual names of multilateral institutions. I'll digress a bit and discuss a bit about these multilateral institutions, which kind of took up the mantle of, financing and funding energy transition and clean energy growth. But as you said, they all came with a rider. There were unjust demands. But now it seems that some of these institutions are redrawing their energy finance strategy, because clearly their existing plans do not seem to be working, because some are focusing on fuel agnostic infra creation, some are focusing on energy transition plans in growing economies. Can you comment on this trend, and do you think it will benefit global South nations?
I think it will benefit the global south, broadly speaking. The World Bank recently announced that it will finance nuclear power, which is a huge shift. The last nuclear power plant they financed was in Italy in 1959. So this is a really major change from their methods of operation. I think not financing nuclear is a huge mistake, particularly given all the technologies emerging on the market. Generally, there has been a shift away in the development institutions from insisting that addressing climate change is the number one goal. I think there's been a shift to a more reasonable balance between climate goals and poverty goals. I think there is a return to the core mission, which is to alleviate poverty in developing countries, and this is a very welcome shift in my view, a shift very much driven by the US, which is the largest shareholder of the World Bank and a major shareholder of other banks. I still think that the multilateral banks can do much more in terms of financing natural gas, which is really essential for industrialization in Africa, despite all of the technological improvements in renewables and battery technologies and so on. There are still things that renewables cannot do. And so the multilaterals need to be much more flexible in terms of addressing or adopting an all of the above approach to energy. That said, I am excited about these newer funders on the horizon. They are much more willing to finance a range of energy sources. I would also include China in that category. China has played a huge role in investing in energy in various African countries. So I think there's a mix of kind of new donors. There are some shifts in the multilateral banks, but in my view, not enough of a shift away from kind of a very rigid view of what energy sources should be for poor countries. And so not enough of a shift there, but at the same time, newer donors emerging, and then the U.S. Reorienting its bilateral funding to energy and infrastructure. There's a major project just announced by the US Millennium Challenge Corporation on energy investments in Cote d'Ivoire. The Millennium Challenge Corporation now completely kind of orienting towards energy. The US Development Finance Corporation, USDFC, also with a very strong energy bent. So I'm hopeful that even as the multilaterals are sort of slow to change, these other funders will fill some of the gaps.
Right. And can I also ask, and this is more of an observation, and I would love your comment on it, is that a lot of these multilateral institutions and some of the new agencies that you mentioned are entering into energy financing space. They usually have this grievance that a lot of poor nations and a lot of the developing world do not pitch their plan very well, and some of them, do not have a robust energy planning per se. You have studied some of these models, you've written about them. Can you, explain our audience here that as a developing nation, what kind of planning should be done, and especially in this today's time when geopolitics is usurping the existing trade mechanism, and there is this new trade map that is being redrawn. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, it's a really important point, Shreya. It's something that people don't talk about enough, I think. So I'm really glad you raised it. This question of sort of being able to do donor speak, present things in a way that donors like is a real problem. I think that the donors are very used to and quite sort of set in their ways in terms of how they want to see projects presented to them. And often poor countries either don't know what those formats are or lack the capacity and the resources to prepare plans in a donor format, so to speak. And I think many good opportunities get lost because of that problem, which I see as a problem imposed by the rich world on the poor world. I think donors should be much more flexible about how poor countries present their ideas and should also help poor countries with their planning so that the projects can have maximum success. That said, I think that the newer funders are more flexible on these types of things. I think the UAE and Saudi Arabia and China and Korea and even some of the even newer donors are kind of willing to sort of meet poor countries where they are. They are less interested in imposing rules and conditions that are dictated by domestic constituencies. So, my view of the multilaterals is that they're very much controlled by Western shareholders, uh, who in turn, Western governments are in turn very much guided or influenced by their domestic environmental NGOs that want to see certain types of energy investments only in poor countries. That then leads to this, very skewed nature of conversations and the kind of, sort of manipulation of, if you will, of documents to please these donors and their preferences. I feel like that whole system is breaking down, and it's all for the good. I think newer donors are less interested in those sorts of machinations. They are much more interested in actually meeting the energy goals of poor countries. Of course, geopolitics is at play there. China wants to build significant influence in Africa and the South Pacific, other parts of the world, and so it's behaving accordingly, and we all need to be aware of that. At the same time, I think that they have provided much needed energy investments where Western donors have dragged their feet or tried to impose conditions. The newer donors have stepped in. They've filled these gaps. They have established new trading relationships, as you point out. So along with these energy investments come all sorts of other investments. So we're seeing a changing landscape, which I think largely is beneficial to poor countries.
No, thank you for addressing that in such a comprehensive manner. I'll come to my last question, and I know that COP has been a failure for some years, at least for poor nations, for developing countries. We haven't been able to get much out of it. We have talked, you have mentioned several times that continues to prioritize the Western nations and their interest. But you talked about how these blocks and these congregations seem to be failing on the priorities and on the nations which need it the most. And this is not just COP. You talk about G7, you talk about the BRICS bloc. However, in the last 2 years at climate summit COP, African governments have been very, very assertive in their demands. Countries such as India, at least 3, 4 years back, have been very assertive in talking about their demand for coal. So one is that, either these countries exit this dialogue because it is serving them no purpose, or go out and be very, very assertive on it. What are you voting on?
So, as you know, Shreya, I did write a piece in Foreign Policy in January of this year saying, Trump is quitting the Paris Agreement. Poor countries should too. I think it sort of reflects my frustration with the COP process and with how little has been delivered for poor countries. I remain very skeptical that this COP will deliver much, or that future COPs will deliver the kinds of resources that poor countries need for adaptation, which is typically not been the emphasis of COPs. They have been very much structured around mitigation, which doesn't make sense in poor countries that consume 1/100th the amount of energy that the US consumes, or that European countries consume. So there's that tension. But apart from that, I think the assertiveness of African governments is very much welcome. I'm very energized by that. I think they have really united. They speak as a unified voice at COPs. They have pushed very hard for climate adaptation funding. They have made the case for loss and damage, for climate reparations. They've pointed out that, they are the ones who are suffering the consequences of what rich countries have done, and cutting back their energy use is not the solution to that problem. The solution to the problem is more resources for adaptation and more resources for energy, which is a critical component of climate adaptation. You need early warning systems, you need paved roads, you need cold storage, and so on to combat rising temperatures and rising sea level and so on. So I think it's very welcome that they're so assertive. I think India, I'm always very impressed by how they stick to what they want and make it very clear that their national priorities are to alleviate poverty and to provide electricity to the farmers and to households and to businesses, and now to develop AI data centers, which is a huge issue for India, a strategic issue, very important issue. And so India's energy needs are very important. They're very critical, and they will come from a whole range of energy sources. And so this kind of lecturing doing at COP is not welcome, and I'm always impressed at how India pushes back on that and does so with great clarity. I think. All of this said, should poor countries exit? I mean, sometimes I feel like they should, because this process is so expensive and time consuming for them. But I think many feel that they need to make their voices heard, and I certainly respect that a great deal.
Yes, absolutely. And we'll see how it pans out this year. It would be very interesting to see if we see the same tone, same aggressiveness from the global south. But yeah, and if there is an exit, that would sure be dramatic, and we would be keen to watch that. But yes, and we look forward to what you have to say after COP concludes this year. Yeah, Vijaya, thank you so much for joining us today. We understood some really useful context on finance, geopolitics, and what a just transition could actually look like for the global south. And it's not just energy security, but as you mentioned, it is also a catalyst to poverty elevation and socioeconomic growth. So today we heard that financing, trade pressures, and infrastructure choices will shape how low income countries can plan a balanced and just energy transition. The answer will need both global financing and local planning. I'm Shreya Jai, and this is COP Conversations from Carbon Copy. Follow us and subscribe on YouTube or Spotify so you don't miss the next episode. See you soon.